So when trying to figure out who the best players in the game are and who's not actually that good at the game, and when actually trying to figure out how to maximize your potential as a player and use all your skills to the best of your ability, it's important to understand how the style you play actually affects that, and actually affects and the style that you play will actually affect how you're able to reach the maximum potential, right? Now, I actually personally believe that in Fortnite, there's a lot of people who play a style that does not even fit their skill set. And a big part of that is just that the culture you have in Fortnite, a lot of people watch their favorite player. They might watch a Mongar, they might watch a Benji Fishy, and they might see the way they play, and they want to replicate that kind of style of play, right? But that doesn't necessarily work for a lot of people, right? If you are somebody who has a more aggressive style of play, but you don't have the skill set to actually match that aggressive style of play, then what are you doing? You're not playing efficiently. You're not playing to the best of your ability, because you're putting yourself in a situation in which your skills don't have the ability to perform the best, right? Now, I think it's important to understand that to find your style, you have to look at your strengths. Look at what you're good at, right? So if you're somebody who has amazing aim and you're somebody who hits a lot of shots and you're able to create plays very well, then maybe an aggressive play style is more suitable for you and your skill set, right? Now, when doing this and understanding this and assessing this about yourself, it's also important to look at your weaknesses, right? And look at how you can limit your weaknesses. Because a big part of being able to be effective in your strength is that you have to limit your weaknesses. Don't put yourself in positions where your weaknesses will thrive and will show. Just limit, it's not necessarily bad to limit your game to your strengths so that you don't necessarily have problems with your weaknesses and your weaknesses don't show as much, right? Now, the way I look at this is, if you look at some of the best players in the world, sometimes it looks like they are just perfect players who don't make any mistakes at all, and that's why I don't necessarily feel bad when I see certain people go, oh, this player is amazing, they're the best in the world, because maybe from watching them it does look that way, but it's because they have gotten so good at not putting themselves in positions where they don't feel comfortable. They've put themselves in positions where their weaknesses won't necessarily show as much. And to give you my own personal example of this, right? Me, when I used to play Fortnite a lot, and even tried to play competitively, I had a more aggressive play style, right? Now, this aggressive playstyle was what felt comfortable to me, what worked for me. But the difference and what the problem was for me was that I was losing a lot of 50-50 fights, and I didn't have the best aim, right? Now, obviously, there's ways to go about fixing that, but for me, the short-term change that I could make without having to put in hours and hours and hours into aim practice and Kovacsing was look back in your VODs, look at where you're taking a lot of 50-50s, try and avoid those positions, and when you get into those positions, don't take the 50-50, right? If you're someone that doesn't have good aim, why are you going to take a lot of 50-50 battles? Because it's most likely that's what's causing you to lose a lot of your games and a lot of your fights. So as much as I did play an aggressive style of play, I also made sure that the fights and the actual angles and battles I was taking within my fights weren't putting me at a 50-50 or weren't putting me at a disadvantage. I always made sure that I took the fight and took the shot that was safest for me in order for me to win the fight, right? Now, it's important to also realize, furthering this, that a lot of the time, people don't realize that for you to become the absolute best in anything, yeah, you can limit it. You can limit your weaknesses all you like, right? If you're a godlike player, you can limit your weaknesses and not let them show. But actually, the all-time best players in anything in life, in any sport, in any esport, are players who have taken their weaknesses and without compromising their strength, they have improved their weaknesses to a point that is it almost becomes their strength. And for a lot of those people, it becomes their strength, right? Now, I'm going to give you a basketball example, and I'm going to give you a Fortnite example. The basketball example, I think, is probably the best one, but a Fortnite example, I'm sure the most people listening will understand that better, right? So, the basketball example I have for this, one of the greatest basketball players of all time, Michael Jordan, when he was a lot younger, in the first half of his career, if you split his career into two halves, in the first half of his career, what his main play style was that he was a slasher. Now, if you play NBA or if you watch basketball, you understand what this means, but for those who don't, essentially, he'd get the ball and he'd use his strength and his athleticism to take the ball to the rim and dunk it, or make a layup, or something of that type. I'm having to describe this very in a basic way, just so that people who don't watch basketball understand this. But he'd essentially get the ball every time, run towards the hoop, and try to score around the rim. Now, what actually happened was that the greater defensive teams in his era, they figured this out, like the Bad Boy Pistons and the Los Angeles Lakers, the Showtime Lakers. What they did was that they figured, okay, this is how this guy is going to score, this is how this guy is going to play, let's limit that, right? So they'd stack a lot of people up in the paint and make sure that when he's going to drive and sure layup or dunk, they were kind of budging him a bit, making it harder for him, and essentially meant that a lot of the time he was still able to dominate games, but he wasn't able to completely stomp games like he did, where he would be getting 50 points or whatnot. He wasn't able to do that, right? Because the people realized that was his strength, and they were like, this is a counter to your strength, right? So we're just going to make things harder for you. So obviously it didn't completely stop him, but it made things harder for him, right? Now, what Michael Jordan did was he realized, okay, this is obviously a way that they're countering me, but what's the counter to that? If I develop a jump shot and if I improve my ability to shoot, then it's not going to matter if they take me to the rim, because if they're going to just try and pack the paint and stop me from getting to the rim, I'm just going to take jump shots, right? I'm going to take fadeaways. I'm going to take all types of shots further away from the basket. And what actually ended up happening was that Michael Jordan ended up becoming one of the best mid-range two-point shooters in all of basketball history. And he ended up having his signature shot be a fadeaway long two-pointer, which is actually probably like the worst shot you can take in basketball, as it's like low efficiency, like it's the least efficient shot you can take. It's the most low percentage shot in all of basketball, but yet he mastered that, right? So it meant that it was at a point where no matter where he was going to score. Right, so what he did was that he took his weakness and made his weakness that he couldn't shoot. He wasn't able to shoot, and it was stopping him, and it meant that he always had to abuse his strength, which was getting to the rim. He took his weakness and he trained on it. He worked on it so much that it actually became his strength, and even one of his biggest strengths. Right, he is the best mid-range fadeaway two-point shooter of all NBA history. Right, now, the Fortnite example that I love to use, and which I think a lot of you will probably understand, is that I look to TSM Xxif, right? Now, if you actually watch back a lot of Xxif's old tournaments and a lot of his old games, one thing that I think everyone knows about Xxif, even if you don't watch him much, is that he has insane aim. He's one of the better aimers in the top elite tier of players that play this game. And what it actually meant for him was that he was really good. He's really good at taking 50-50 fights in endgame, and it meant that when he was aggressive and he's taking certain fights, he was winning most of these fights that he took, right? Now, what actually ended up happening is that sometimes it mean that he took too many fights, right? Or maybe he was a bit over aggressive or a bit greedy, right? Because he knew that most of the time, that's my strength, is that I'm able to hit these shots in endgame. I know if I peek this one, I know if I take this angle, I'm more likely to get some shots off and kill a player. Pardon me. And that meant that oftentimes he'd be a bit greedy. Maybe he'd look for too many kills. His strength was that he was aggressive, but his weakness was that he was over aggressive to the point where it was stopping him and causing him to lose, situations. Maybe if he wasn't so over aggressive, he would have won. But what he did was that he was able to master that and make sure he worked on being able to know when it's the right time to be aggressive. And obviously, if he's streaming, sometimes this is a joke that and I have with him, that if he's streaming, he's kind of trolling. He doesn't necessarily play as seriously. But if you actually look, like even in squads now, this is translated from solos to squads. In squads, he's the person who's able to make plays, probably the best on his team. But he doesn't just go around making plays every single game. He's mastered knowing when the right time to make plays are, and it meant that what was one of his weaknesses, right? That fact that he was over aggressive and he'd sometimes over peak things because he knew that he had the aim to usually kill the player. It meant that he mastered knowing when the right time to do this was, and it's become one of his strengths. He's one of the more intelligent players in the game when it comes to being able to take fights in endgame and how efficient he moves around in the late game and actually gets those kills, right? Now, a lot of this is what translates into my next point of the fact that a lot of people don't realize that your weakness is usually a component of your strength, right? Now, if you don't understand what I mean by that, a lot of the time, if you look at the Xxif example I gave you just there, his strength is that he is a great playmaker and that he has amazing aim, which means that he takes a lot of 50-50 battles and he takes a lot of fights and a lot of unique angles, which usually he wins, right? Because that's his strength. That's something that he's incredibly good at. That's something that he's worked on really hard. But what his weakness was as a result of that was the fact that he'd often take too many of those fights and do too many of those engagements, and it was causing him to lose sometimes unnecessarily, right? Like the biggest thing when looking at your weaknesses is that you don't want your weakness to compromise your strength. Right? If let's say Xxif, right, was assessing that part of his game, and he said, "Hey, look, man, I'm taking a lot of these fights, and I know I'm good at them, but sometimes it causes me to die. Let me just stop taking them in general." If he had done that, that would have been him compromising his strength as a result of his weakness, right? That's not the right way to go about things, right? You never want to compromise your strength. Your strength is the one thing that you want to work on the most and make sure that you master that, right? As part of your style, as part of the way that you play, you want that your strength to be the number one thing that you have set in stone. So instead of compromising his strength by trying to take less of those fights, he went back and practiced and understood when was the best time to take those fights, rather than just not taking those fights at all, right? So it's important to understand that your weakness is a component of your strength usually, right? So for example, for another example, what's the best example to give? Just in any game, actually, I'd say. Not even in any game you play. If you are someone that plays Counter-Strike, right, and you play CSGO and you have amazing aim and you're an amazing entry fragger, sometimes your weakness, you'll often notice that people who are like that, their weakness is that they are too aggressive, right? If you're somebody who's a lot smarter of a player, one of my good friends in the scene, and someone who I think is an amazing player, Nobody, also known as Brandon, and I'm thinking of this on the fly. He is incredible at making the right play, right? Like 9 times out of 10, if he's in a team fight or team build fight or whatever, he's gonna make the right play to ensure that he's able to stay alive and ensure that his team is able to stay in the best position to win the game as a whole, right? But when discussing this with him, we realized that, so what might be part of his weakness is the fact that he doesn't necessarily take risks, right? It's always good to take risks in the game. Taking calculated risks is always good to take, right? But what he sometimes will do is he'll play in a way that makes sure that he is in the best position to always stay alive, when there might be another option that he could take, which is a risk, but as long as it's a calculated risk, it's something that's better to take, right? So it's important to always establish the fact that always look at your strengths and look at how your weaknesses come from your strengths and how you can limit those things without compromising your strengths. You never want to compromise your strength. Now, I think it's important to understand that when looking at your strengths and what you're good at, it's important. The reason why it's so essential to work on your weaknesses is because eventually your strengths can only take you so far, right? You have to build up a complete game in order to be all around one of the better players. Now, the team example I'll give, not just an individual player, because a lot of people, I think you can apply this to your team and the way your team plays, is if you look back in the early days of Fortnite, one of the most dominant teams in the game, in the EU scene at least, was the Atlantis team with Vilex, Mitro, Giganza, and Majin. Now, they were a great team. They won a lot of events. If you look back at, like, a lot of people might have believed this, right? But if you look back in the Fortnite Gamepedia, whatever it is, the Atlantis team with Mitro, Vilex, Giganza, and Majin were incredible. But what was the biggest thing about them, and any OG player will tell you this to this day, they were high ground warriors. If you were playing in the scrim and you looked in high ground, it was most likely they were there. They were the team on high ground dominating the game. But what this actually meant, they were so good at taking high ground. This was their biggest strength. They always took high ground. They were always incredibly good at taking high ground. But what it actually meant was that if they didn't have high ground, they didn't know what to do. Like, that was the biggest that was their biggest weakness, right? Their biggest weakness was that if they didn't have high ground, they most likely would not win the game. Because they were so good at playing high ground that they hadn't necessarily focused on how to play mid ground or how to play low ground as much, because they just practiced always getting high ground. So if they didn't have high ground, 9 times out of 10, they probably wouldn't have won the game, right? So it's important now, as a team, if that's something that you have a problem with is in your team, it's important now to look at, okay, how that is the problem. That is our weakness. So instead of just not doing anything about that and continuing to just hammer in on high ground and trying to make sure you have high ground, it's important to now strengthen your game in other areas to make sure that your weaknesses are no longer your weaknesses, right? Because their weakness was a component of their strength. They were so good at playing high ground that they didn't know how to play anything other than high ground. So to fix that, to balance that, all they had to do was just work on their mid game, work on how to play mid game, or work on how to play low ground. Now, obviously, I don't think they necessarily did this because they ended up splitting up, or whatever. But that is just what advice I would give to them, right? And as a whole, I think that is the most important key part of elevating your game and extending your game to the best of your ability. I think I'm going to take some questions now. Anyone have any questions? How to find a solo landing spot you're comfortable with. I see players like Mongrel who are more than capable of contesting lazy, mystic, etc., but lands in a shack near Slurpee. Just not sure what to test out, etc. I'd say when it comes to things like that, this actually is a part of finding your style, which is why I actually like this question. This is a very big part of finding your style. Knowing what engagement, like, so somebody historically who I think has gone very underrated just because of the way they play and people not liking the way they play is Sam. Now, Sam is somebody who historically is not the best player mechanically. He's not Mongrel with mechanics. He's not Booger with mechanics. But Sam has always been one of the best players at playing the meta and taking advantage of the meta. People call him a ball player. People call him a flipping sword player, whatever it is. But because he's not the best mechanical player, how he made up for that was being able to take advantage of the meta and take advantage of the things in the game that are broken, right? So it's always about that compromise. You have to find a way to compromise. So you need to figure out as a player, what am I good at? How do I want to rotate? If I'm someone who I'm not good at fighting and taking engagements, I'm not someone who wins fights, land somewhere on the map where you're further out, or also another thing, I think you should be able to land at multiple places. I don't think you should just have one set landing spot, but that's just my personal opinion. I don't know who disagrees. I don't care if you disagree. I just think you should be able to land at multiple places on the map. Now, I think that if you are somebody who is not good at taking many engagements, I think you should probably look to rotate most of the time through the slower side of the zone. Look at how your loop path will push you. Often, obviously, you don't know where the zone is every map, but look at places where you find yourself in lower populated areas on the map. As a player, you have the fortune of being able to look back at, let's say, the solo cash cup that's happening right now. I think it might be finished now, but let's say the solo cash cup, right? Go back to every solo cash cup game and look at every single map, right? Because I'm pretty sure you can see the whole map and where everyone lands, right? If you're on the leaderboards. If you're not on the leaderboards, I'm not sure if you can see it in replays. But let's say you're on the leaderboards and you can see where everybody landed in your game. Go back and see where everyone landed and see what are the least populated areas and try those areas for yourself. Try figuring out how you rotate when the zone is in a certain place and what rotation you can make to take less engagements. Figure out what place has the best mats for you, because if you're someone that's not going to take engagements during the early game and the mid game, you need to make sure you're taking a loop path that allows you to farm a lot. And then obviously, if you're somebody who is an aggressive player, you don't need to necessarily prioritize the amount of material you get from a landing spot, because you know that you're gonna go out and fight people who are gonna have those materials for you, right? You're gonna play for impact frags. So it's about understanding who you are as a player and what you do and what you're good at doing, and then applying that to where you land in your drop spot and how you move around the map. I legit land on 2 chest spawns. I suck at spawn fighting. And hey, that was me as well. If any of you, I haven't played much of the new map, and I need to, because I need to understand the map a lot better to be able to give good analysis on things. But as somebody who, on the last map, I used to land, if you guys know where Paradise was on the last map, I used to land by the bridge near Paradise that led towards Salty, and I landed there every game, and that place does not have the best loot, right? That place does not have the best loot at all. But what I did was I'd get, a couple chests there, loot a bit, then I'd go to Paradise, or I'd go towards Racetrack, and I'd fight the people there, right? Because I knew that I was good at taking those, the time where people have just finished clearing up fighting, so maybe they've stopped fighting their initial landing spots, and now they're just farming up. I was good at taking fights with those kind of people, and I would often win, right? So I didn't necessarily have to land at Paradise and loot up and have to fight those early game fights. I would land outside of a POI and then slowly rotate in as fights had broken down, etc., right? So it's all about just knowing who you are as a player, what you're good at, and fitting your game style to that. Please, I hate when I see this. I see this too much. I see kids watching Benji You watch Benji, like, okay, what's the best example? The last season trios. This is the best example I can give. Last season trios, kids saw Benji, Mongrel, and Micho destroying kids landing retail. Let me say something, buddy. You are not them. You landing at retail is not what's going to elevate your game. Now that I'm landing retail, I'm going to finally start winning events. Yeah, don't get me wrong. Retail boosted their ability to win a lot because they had god tier loot. But just because you see them land there and have success from it, doesn't mean you are not as good as them. You need to figure out what you are good at and what your strengths are and play to that rather than just trying to copy other people, right? A lot of players in our game might play very aggressive, over-aggressive, W key kind of styles of play, but that's not what they're suited to. That's not what their skill set is suited to, right? You're not that good, unfortunately. Maybe you're like a creative warrior and you have that kind of skill, but you're not necessarily. There's obviously people who lead and people who call, and I think if you're somebody who's good at seeing the game from an outside perspective and not just very like tunnel vision on what's happening in front of you, if you're someone who can look at the way there's people set up in the zone, etc. If that's something you're good at, why are you there trying to play like flipping Mongrel? Why are you doing that? You're not. You know what I mean? Like, you play to your strength. I think if you're a supportive player, if you're someone who plays more of a supportive role, you're somebody who's really good at taking trades, who's really good at fighting with someone and supporting someone, then play to that, right? I think, let's say different players who I'd say to watch, like I enjoy watching Mongrel play, but if I'm trying to learn something, I'm not gonna go to Mongrel first to learn. Do you understand what I'm saying there? I'd say the biggest thing is, it goes back to the VOD reviewing video I made just last week. This is something that you should do while you VOD review. Just list out your strengths. List out in your games, every game that you play. So let's say for the solos today, because I know a lot of people would have, or solos, whatever time you're watching, a lot of people probably don't like solos and you don't like how you played in those solos. So go back and watch the VOD for each game and look at what your strength was, what you're good at, what you did good in that game, and what you did good consistently, right? Because not just one time, maybe you hit some mad shot, oh yeah, I'm a sick aimer, no. What you did on a game-to-game basis that you're consistently good at as a player. And a lot of people don't realize that a lot of your strengths actually transfer from other areas of life, right? People learn and take things in from all over their lives, and they actually apply them. And some people, though, go from game to game and like completely change up who they are. Like, if you are somebody who you were an entry fragger when you played CSGO, or let's say that you're an entry fragger when you played CSGO, why are you now like coming into Fortnite and you're trying to be like the most methodical, smart, intelligent player ever? Like, try apply what you were good at in other games to this. If you're someone who you played, where's the example I had from my guy Nobody? If you are somebody who played Tracer on Overwatch, right? Tracer is someone who a lot of aggressive players play. Like, if you're an aggressive player in Overwatch, you have probably tried playing Tracer in your life. If you're someone who played Tracer in Overwatch, don't come into Fortnite and now you're trying to be like a slow, methodical player. Play to what you're good at. Play to your strengths and what you've learned in other games and other aspects of the world. And then now come back, like I said, you've listed out all your strengths now. Now, look at how all your strengths leads to weaknesses in your gameplay, right? Now look at all your weaknesses, look at all the things that you were consistently doing wrong, and try and mix and match. Like, literally just try and look at this is my strength, this is my weakness, they link somehow. How do I minimize my weakness without also minimizing and compromising my strength, right? So once you're able to do this with all your strengths and all your weaknesses, that should improve your gameplay and maximize your skill level and maximize your ability to reach your potential, right? Because a lot, like I said in the beginning, a lot of players will not reach their potential ever because they're stuck in a style and a role that's not good for them, right? Like, if you are somebody who is a very slow, methodical player and you're constantly just trying to play a fast-paced, aggressive play style, you're never going to reach the best player you can be just because you're not playing in a role that suits what you are good at. Leven, are there any players I should watch who are kind of in the mid-ground of cracked mechanics but also play a smart and slow play style with someone like Mongrel and Benji? Good question. For someone like that, I'd say these solo cups are really good at figuring out usually who those players are. A player I'd advise a lot of people to watch is Tohaj. Yeah, I'd say G2 Tohaj is someone who's really great to watch for that kind of thing. When you say mechanics, are you referring to consider like how good is your aim? Because there are a lot of people who I think like are good, really good aimers in our game, but in terms of building mechanics, they aren't necessarily the best. So I'd say go watch Tohaj. Watch somebody like, I'm trying to think of EU and NA. Watch somebody like Macwoods in NA. Watch somebody like Bella EU's great. Watch Mr. Savage, because even though Mr. Savage has great mechanics, he is also a really good decision maker. But also another thing is that a lot of the time I'd say don't necessarily, I mean, who's like good at aiming and building, but also smart methodical player. Good at aiming, but also smart methodical player. I'd say definitely watch Xxif and how he rotates and how he plays early game, and like how the tempo changes from early game to late game with how he plays. I'd say definitely who in this season? I'm thinking of a lot of older season players. I'd say watch the CRR stream. If CRR streams, I'd say watch CRR, because even though he's a controller player and he has like, yeah, like even though he's a controller player, I think he's a really good decision maker. From watching what I can in the in-game replay. So in solos, I'm very good in endgame playing for top 5 placements, but every time I go back into replays where I hesitate for the easy kills, but instead just continue rotating, is that something that comes with practice? Yeah, like that is something that literally comes with practice, right? You need to go into scrims, like outside of this, I don't know how much solo practice there is nowadays, because I know people hate solos, but like when practicing solos, practice those things, like go into games, and like, I know obviously you always have to play to win, but make sure you're putting yourself in that position as much as you can and practice taking, and make sure you don't hesitate for the easy kills, right? You have it in your mind, like one day, just go into every single solo game you play and go, when I get into flipping a situation where I have an easy kill, do not hesitate. If that means you're not thinking about other things, like if that means it's taken away from other things for your practice, then like for that day of practice, so be it, right? So that you make sure that specific thing, you avoid that completely. And it's good that you've even been able to identify that, because a lot of people don't identify their problems, which is what's stopping them.